And following that violence at the Capitol yesterday, lawmakers from both sides of the aisle are now calling to remove President Trump by impeachment or by invoking the 25th Amendment. That amendment states that the vice president does become president if the sitting president dies, resigns, or is removed from office. It also establishes procedures needed for filling the vice president's then empty seat. In order to move forward with the amendment, the VP and a majority of the president's own cabinet members need to declare that the president is unfit to fulfill his duties. Joining us tonight to talk more about the 25th Amendment is University of Chicago law professor Jonathan Masur. Thank you so much, sir. I appreciate you being here. There's been a lot of chatter, political chatter on Capitol Hill about the 25th Amendment today. Obviously, we've not seen it enacted often, but it is there for a reason. I'm no constitutional scholar, but can you give us the Cliff Notes version of what it is, what it does, and why it's there?
Sure. So the 25th Amendment basically exists for an orderly transfer of power if the president can't discharge his duties as president for any reason. It actually has been used a fair number of times just in sort of run-of-the-mill cases when the president is sick or undergoes surgery and has to be anesthetized. There's a sort of voluntary transfer of power to the vice president. But the part of the 25th Amendment you're talking about, the fourth section of it, that would be an involuntary transfer of power. That's where if the vice president and a majority of the cabinet think that the president is no longer fit to exercise the duties of president, they can submit a statement to Congress stating that they don't believe the president is capable any longer, and then the vice president takes over as president at that point.
Have we ever seen it used before in that involuntary way you described? And when was the last time? Hate to give you a history quiz, but just curious.
We've never seen it used before in American history, and it's barely even been talked about this seriously. There was some discussion of it in the waning years of Franklin Roosevelt's last term when he was very ill, and it was unclear whether he could continue to be president because of his illness, but never for a president who is still relatively healthy in a situation like this one.
And we should point out that there is reporting tonight that Vice President Pence is not in favor of using this, so the likelihood of this happening seems next to none, but it is being bandied about. Can you talk a little bit about, is there anything part of this that is misunderstood or not known? Because I thought that there was something in the law that allowed the president to push back or fight this, and it triggered some kind of process. They just can't do it, and then the president would be gone. Does he have any chance to push back and fight it?
So you're exactly right about that. There's a real back and forth that's written into the Constitution. So the vice president and the majority of the cabinet, they transmit a message to Congress stating that they think the president is incapable of serving. The president can then transmit a message of his own stating that he in fact is capable of serving. And then if the vice president and the cabinet don't reply within 4 days, he reassumes his powers. But if within 4 days they transmit yet another message reiterating that they believe that he is incapable of serving and discharging his duties as president, then the vice president will retain all powers of the presidency until Congress votes. And Congress would have to vote to strip the president of his authority by a 2/3 margin in both houses. And only then would the vice president be able to assume the powers of the presidency for an extended period of time.
So the president the president can object, and that does trigger the process you just described.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And the one last wrinkle to this is that Congress has to act within 21 days, or else the president gets his powers back. And so in a situation like this one, Congress could simply choose not to act, and the president's term would end before the Constitution calls for any action by Congress.
All right, now we're 13 days away from, obviously, the new administration coming in. The fascinating component of the amendment to me has always been the idea that you have to get the cabinet on board because those are people appointed by the president, so you always assume those are people that are very loyal to the commander-in-chief. So getting them to a scenario where they vote to remove the president seems like a nice security blanket there to make this an unusual move, which it should be because it is such a drastic measure.
I think that that's exactly right. It's really an extraordinary remedy to strip the president of his powers and transfer them to someone else. So that's a sort of remedy that we only want to see invoked when there's very good cause to invoke it. And a majority of the cabinet and the vice president all agreeing on it, that sort of agreement is only going to occur in really extraordinary circumstances.
All right. I think I butchered your name the first time, Jonathan Masur. Thank you for being with us, Professor. We certainly appreciate that. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.